I was probably supposed to flip it so it wasn't filming like this, but at this point, if I touch it again, it's going to explode. So.
That's how I ended up there. I only say that 1 year.
Okay.
Didn't get the education right.
That hurt.
Then the whole world. No, but I need to talk. I need
First place respect.
If you're lucky, you can get fast.
Well, that does save a little embarrassment.
That's not, I don't know how to do that. But I thought we got to the point where
Yep, that looks good.
Is it transmitting or recording or whatever it's supposed to be doing?
I'm on it right now.
Yes.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. Evan's coming around with copies of this week's class. If you hopefully you got it, just put it right up there on the, some up there. I am I'm working on getting it all put together. Right now, it's still a week-by-week process, but the general format is going to be the same each week. So we're getting there. Usually, after Dave speaks, there's very little time to give us a nice little transition. No, it's good to see everybody this morning. We have many that are out of town, and many that are not feeling well, but it's good to see those of you that are here. We have started this quarter a study of different congregations in the New Testament, looking at and exploring the New Testament church. Last week we started with the first one, the church at Jerusalem. And this week we're going to start with another unusual one. Last week's was unusual because there is no letter to the church at Jerusalem. So we can, we had to piece together what we know about it, but they're very well documented in the book of Acts. This week's church has a letter, but there is something unique about the church in Rome. We have a letter written to the Romans, so we're going to spend some time there, but we're also going to look at the makeup of the church there in Rome. And I say this is unusual because when was the church formed? And the question usually has a biblical passage. Like, I'm not going to ask you to go into history and dig through Wikipedia or whatever and guess what time frame these churches were formed. Most of the time that's going to be from the scripture. And so last week we looked at Jerusalem and when was the church formed, and we talked about that, largely centered around Pentecost. But the problem with the church in Rome is, does anybody know when the church was founded?
Best you got is Acts, the first chapter, verse 10. There were proselytes or visitors from Rome who were in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost.
Absolutely. In Acts chapter 1, we've already talked about how men have come to Pentecost, Jews from all over. In chapter 2, when Peter and the rest get up to speak, we see starting in verse 9, Parthians and Medes and Elamites, those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya adjoining Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them speaking in our own tongues the wonderful works of God. So we have people from all over the world, including, very specifically mentioned there, visitors from Rome. Now, who's in power at this point in time? Who is the leading controller of the world secularly? Rome. Do you think that any of these Parthians and Medes and Elamites and Mesopotamians and Judeans, etc., lived in Rome?
Probably lived in Rome, they didn't live there.
I mean, there's people from, well, let's just put it like this. Is everybody here in this country right now from this country? We're hosting some big football, soccer games. Well, yeah, people from all over. There's, people from all over the world here in our country right now. Some of these people, they may be Cretans, they may be Egyptians, they may be Mesopotamians, but they could live in Rome. Regardless, we know there's specifically visitors mentioned here in Rome. And what did people do after Pentecost? Eventually you go back home. Now we have some that remain, but eventually people go back home. So is it possible that people here at Pentecost heard the teachings of the apostles, stayed with them for a while, and then returned back to Rome? Absolutely. And then what would they do when they get to Rome? If they've been meeting with the apostles, and we know the apostles have been teaching and they've been breaking of bread on the first day of the week and they've been worshiping together, it's natural to assume that these people, convicted by the truth, returned to Rome and founded a congregation there. Any other guess as to when? Let's argue this. When can we prove that there has been a church in Rome. Maybe not when it was established, but does anybody know? Well,
Paul wrote the letter to them, there was somebody to write to.
so sometime between Pentecost, which was 30 to 33 AD, and when Paul on his second journey writes to the Romans, probably from Corinth, somewhere in the 49, 50, 51 era. So somewhere in that 20 years or so, there's a church founded in Rome. There's people there to be in Rome. Now, we usually see these churches formed when Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Timothy and whomever get from town to town. Do we remember when Paul gets to Rome?
After he's a captain.
The very end of the book of Acts. Paul finally gets to go to Rome. He tells the Romans that he wants to go there. He tells those that he's with that he wants to go to Rome. But we don't actually see Paul in Rome until the end of the book of Acts when Paul is a prisoner. Is there already a church there in Rome? Yes, if we turn, I didn't write the verse down, but I will find in chapter 28 of Acts, verse 14, go verse 13. From there we circled round and reached Rhegium, and after one day the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren and were invited to stay with them 7 days, and so we went toward Rome. And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as Appii Forum and 3 Inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. The brethren there in Rome knew that Paul was coming, and they went out to meet him. One estimate that I saw was that's possibly a 52-mile trip. So the church in Rome was aware that Paul was on his way, and they went out to meet them. So they're already there. When Paul first gets to Rome, there are already Christians worshiping at a congregation in Rome. Let's get this out of the way. Did Peter go to Rome? We have no evidence that Peter was in Rome. It's not mentioned in the book of Acts. It's not mentioned in his own letters. When Paul greets the church in Rome there at the end of the book of Romans, he doesn't mention Peter as being somebody there. Now, who thinks Paul was? Not you guys. Who in the world thinks that Paul was instrumental in the church in Rome? Who?
Peter,
Yes, Peter. The Catholics.
necessary for their tradition.
The Catholics have assigned Peter as the first pope. Now, the first pope, I'm not going to go into the history of the Catholic Church. Dave will do that for you. You get the certain churches, and they all have their bishops, and they all fight amongst themselves and decide that the Bishop of Rome is the more important of all the different bishops. And so then you got to go backwards to create a history. So you create Peter as being the Bishop of Rome, as being the first pope. But there's no evidence that Peter was there. Neil?
In Romans first chapter, verse 11, that's where I long to see you that I may impart to you some spiritual gifts so that you may be established. That is, you may be encouraged together you once are. Paul was wanting to impart spiritual gifts to them when he got there, which would indicate, so that they would be established, which would indicate that they didn't have any spiritual gifts, which would indicate that there wasn't an apostle that established them.
Absolutely. I think we can see at the beginning of the book of Romans that Paul has eliminated himself, Peter, and any other apostle from even being in Rome. Could you have a church established without one of the apostles being there and doing the establishing? Absolutely. That's what happens today, right?
Yeah, there's no apostles now.
Right. We have no apostles now, but we decided a little over a year ago that we would form a group here. Of the two groups that merged together, was there an apostle that established either one of those groups? Jesus established this. We read the scriptures. We decided on what they were saying. We agreed. We found others that agreed with us, and we met together and formed a congregation. That's a natural thing that can happen. It did not require the apostles to do that. And seeing that was that had happened in Rome is pretty phenomenal. You know, it showed that even though the apostles were there, you could still start a congregation. You could still have dedicated believers without an apostle right there in the middle of it, which is, to me, the power of the word. Neil?
I knew a preacher 40 years or so ago that met some individuals who were eating just like we are, except they had no idea that anybody else in the whole world that believed what they believed. They had just started from scratch with the Bible.
That's the theory, right? That's our hope in the word, that strangers who had never heard of religion at all or the Bible could take this Bible and form a congregation of believers true to what the apostles taught, true to what Jesus taught 2,000 years ago. It's the simplicity of the word. So you have people that were there and were taught by the apostles. Some may have even heard Jesus speak at some point. And then they went back to their cities and they formed those congregations. Rome would actually be the second earliest church that we're aware of. Paul writes to them while on his second journey. There are some congregations that have already been established. There's some that Paul establishes as he comes through. We have 12 other apostles going in all different directions. But we have good evidence that the church in Rome was shortly after the church in Jerusalem. I put a big wide range here because that covers from Pentecost all the way to the end of Paul's second journey. Somewhere in that span of time, Christians had met and gathered and formed the church in Rome. There probably were several congregations. As we read through chapter 16, and we notice the breaks, he starts addressing a group, and then it seems like he starts addressing somebody else. There probably were several congregations in Rome at that time. Now, would that be a shock that there's several congregations? Rome was the biggest city in the world. Rome was huge, had a vast reach. So think about Atlanta. Can you number several congregations in the Atlanta area? Think about Athens, Alabama, or some of the other places, Tampa, Florida. You know, it's a large city with lots of different congregations, and that's what it would seem to indicate. So he's probably not writing just to one church in Rome. He's probably writing to the various congregations. All right. Do you know? Oops. I got a couple of blank pages. Don't know how that happened. All right, Rome. We looked at where Jerusalem was last year. Where in the world is Rome? Jerusalem was down here. Rome is a good ways away, almost all the way to the end of our map. We're looking at maybe the easternmost congregation last week, and we're looking at the westernmost congregation that next week. Boy, Peter has a lot of ground to cover. Saul has a lot of ground to cover. You know?
The significance of it, Rome is the center of the world. All roads lead to Rome. Is the expression of that. It was the ruling deal. So they had congregation there had a lot of influence in the sense of people going in and out. Jerusalem is very much similar to that. We didn't talk about it, but in the ancient world, where Jerusalem and Judea was a strip of fertile ground with the ocean to the left and the desert to the right. You had Egypt and Africa below it and everything else north of it. And everything that happened in the ancient world went through that area. And so the same thing, the church spread Jerusalem, Judea, some areas down in those parts of the earth. So each one of the cities really, when we go through them, are significant in their location because of the influence and people moving in and out and the areas that they are over.
It's almost like there was a plan.
Yeah.
It's almost like somebody behind the scenes said, all right, we're going to start over here. We're going to hit over here. There's major roads that go through there. There's major thoroughfares, and that's going to help the message spread. I mean, it's almost like somebody thought, oh, wait, somebody probably did think it out. You know, you can see how by the end of the New Testament, they can legitimately say the word had traveled all over the world, at least the known world. I mean, in 70 short years, you've got this whole area over here learning and knowing the truth. The word spreading. And remember, it starts with one guy down here in Jerusalem, and then 12 guys, and then it builds and builds. But that's how, without the internet, without cars, without anything that we have to do, mass production of books, that the word can spread. Paul is not traveling mysterious roads. Paul's traveling the main highways to go from city to city to city. And then from there, it spreads and spreads and spreads. It's beautiful. All right. Who are some people that we know were in Rome? Priscilla and Aquila, that was the bonus question right there. Priscilla and Aquila, let's go all the way back to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18, so this is another hint as to when this group was founded. Paul has been through Berea, he's been through Athens, he's made his way to Corinth. Acts chapter 18, verse 1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. So if we go back to our map, we have Paul in Corinth over here. And when he gets to Corinth over here, he's meeting Priscilla and Aquila, who had come from Rome. And why did they leave Rome? What did the text tell us about the reason why Priscilla and Aquila were no longer in Rome?
They were invited to leave.
Yes. Claudius was the Roman emperor, and the Romans were no big fans of the Christians, and for whatever reason, he commanded that not just the Jewish Christians, but all Jews leave Rome. Eventually, Claudius dies, and Nero invites them back until AD 64, when Rome burns, and Nero very conveniently blames the Christians, and then the persecution starts anew. But at this point in time, Priscilla and Aquila have moved there to Corinth. So because he was in the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So he's teaching there along with Ananias, I get them mixed up, Aquila and Priscilla. In Romans chapter 16, we see that Aquila and Priscilla have returned to Rome, probably sometime after Claudius had died. In verse 3, Paul, writing to the churches there in Rome, says, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles." So we know Priscilla and Aquila were members in Rome, probably before and again now, as important parts of that congregation. There's a couple of other people mentioned in the book of Acts, and then a number of people mentioned in Romans chapter 16. I won't go through all of that list, but in Acts chapter 28, we know that Paul eventually gets there. Verse 15 of, I don't want to start, yes, verse 15 of chapter 20, of Acts chapter 28. "And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as Appii Forum and Three Inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. Now when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with the soldier who guarded him. And it came to pass after 3 days that Paul called the leaders of the Jews together. So when they had come together, he said, 'Men and brethren, Though I have done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. So he takes opportunity to teach with them and work with them. But I buried the mention of somebody in that first verse that I read there. Who else do we know was in Rome? Go back to verse 15. There's the word we. We meaning the person who was writing this, and Paul and others. And we know who wrote the book of Acts. That was Luke. If we go back to chapter 26, we know that Aristarchus, chapter 27, sorry, Aristarchus, the Macedonian of Thessalonica, was also with them. One other mention is all the way in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 17. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 17. Nope. 2 Timothy. Oh, I'm looking at chapter 2. Chapter 1 and verse 17. I'm going to start verse 16. The Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he sought me out very zealously and found me. Does anybody remember who Onesiphorus is? Oh, I'm getting him mixed up with somebody else, aren't I? Never mind. Say again?
You're thinking of slave.
I'm thinking of the wrong person. Okay. Romans chapter 16 has a wealth of people mentioned, including notably, and I say notably for the times and for the Bible itself, many women are mentioned there in Romans 16. Not a lot of women got particular attention in that time. This is some of the earliest historical literature to specifically mention women. We know of Mary. We know of women who people met in their church. Phoebe in verse 1, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Centuria, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you, for indeed she has been a helper of many, and of myself also. So a long list of people there that Paul would greet and would meet. All right. We do want to look at not sure how that will look. We do want to look at the weaknesses and the strengths of this group, but I wanted to guide us in a little bit of a direction. Go to Romans chapter 2 and 3 and kind of scan through those verses there. Now we have a church that is established here in Rome. Rome has a large number of Jews living there, even before the writing of the New Testament. Rome obviously has a lot of Gentiles living in there as well. As you scan through chapters 2 and 3 of Romans, and you think, okay, Paul felt the need to write these brethren, what are some of the things he's going to have to talk to them about? Looking particularly at Romans 2 and 3, what was a major source of contention among the brethren in the church in Rome? Circumcision. What about the circumcision?
Weird, don't we?
The Jews did, right? Going all the way back to Abraham, the Jews prided themselves. That's how you could tell a Jew from a non-Jew. The descendants of Abraham were circumcised. But there was no requirement of circumcision for the Greeks. So now that we have a congregation made up of Jews who have heard about Jesus, they've heard his teaching, they've said, we're going to follow him. And then Gentiles, who didn't know anything about circumcision or why you would get circumcised, now we have them mixed together. Now, why would they disagree on that?
Well, you had Jews that wanted to force Gentiles to be circumcised and keep the law before they could become Christians. They wanted to add that qualification. Their motive seems to be the idea that no matter what a Gentile did, he could never be a Jew. So if he submitted to that, he was acknowledging that the Jews were superior to the Gentiles under the law of Christ, and that he was inferior to those Jews. And that seems to be the motive that the Jews had in doing that. They'd always been used to the idea that we're the people of God, all during the Mosaic age, and that we are superior to the Gentiles who are not the people of God. And they could not accept the idea that God would accept Jews and Gentiles on equal basis,
It's
was a problem.
hindsight's 2020. We can look back and we can say that was all done away with. But imagine you're living there at the time.
Ground zero.
You're a Jew. You come through the door. You're a Jew who has been converted. Okay, you come through the door. The room is, empty. You sit over there. Then another friend who is a Jew that y'all had been at the synagogues together. Y'all had, celebrated Passover together. They come in. They see you. They sit down next to you. Somebody comes in and they're not a Jew. They've never known those things. In fact, they've always known that the Jews hated them. And they've kind of hated the Jews as well. So you come in and you maybe sit over there. And suddenly, by the time worship starts, that side of the room is the Jews, and that side of the room is the Gentiles. Could you see conflict? Could you see animosity? Could you see difficulty? Chapter 2 of Romans, verse 11. For there is no partiality with God. We've heard this all of our life, but think of the context. Why does Paul need to write this? Do we need a reminder of that today? Listen, the Jews and the Gentiles they're both okay. Does David need to do a week-long series on that? We understand that. But go back to then. And Paul is hearing about these people in Rome, and he's appreciative that there's a church there, and he wants to get over to talk to them. But what is he hearing about this group? Go back to verse 5. But in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each one according to his deeds. Eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish on every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first and also of the Greek, but glory, honor, and peace to everyone who works what is good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For there is no partiality with God. Who's Paul yelling at?
Yes.
Yeah. Like, you Jews, yeah, the word came to you. You were the church, you were the nation of God who rejected God, and then he rejected you. Yeah, you guys are guilty. Oh, and you guys, the Greeks, you're also guilty. Why does he have to say this? I mentioned last week, when I teach class, I like to speculate, and I don't want to go outside the bonds of the word. But think about what the attitude in Rome was like that requires Paul to write this letter to them. Think about David comes up here and he preaches on this. And you're like, ooh, I guess that's a real problem that we're having right now. Or I wonder why he's bringing that up right now. This is Paul's letter to these Romans. Hey, you've got to fix this. You've got to correct this. Any other? Well, we'll skip that. Could there be a similar problem like this in a local congregation today? Not this one. We're going to absolve ourselves of any problems because we don't have it.
Right.
But obviously, I don't know that we're going to have a Jew versus non-Jew debate. But what is a similar issue that a congregation could have today? Okay?
Those raised in the church as children or from children or grandchildren versus those who are later converts?
That was what I had. I called them first generation Christians versus those raised in the church. Could that be a problem? Again, I'm not suggesting that's a problem here, but what would that look like? I was raised in the church. Father was an elder, my grandfather was an elder.
You'll be one of the, if that's the case, you'll oftentimes be one of the very first ones picked at age 14 to get up and lead singing versus a recent high school or college or even middle-aged convert who will sit in the pews for years before somebody taps them and says, hey, by the way, why should there be a difference?
Right. Why would there be a difference? How might people feel about that? I mean, some people might be glad. It's like, don't pick me. But you might feel like I've never, is my salvation not the same? Like, do you not think I'm worthy of getting to lead and participate in the worship? AJ?
I think people that grew up in the church sometimes have not enough grace towards new converts in the fact that they are a new convert and they're still learning things and they might still be struggling with some things from their past, and they can lack some grace in that.
I love my sons. They can be a little high and mighty sometimes. And I would consider them raised in the church. I was not raised in the church. So they have had a different upbringing. I didn't have a bad upbringing, but spiritually, they have had a different upbringing. And sometimes we have to talk to them about what it's like for the person who's never gone to church before. What it's like. Not that we're supposed to be, well, we'll overlook your sins, but where is that grace? I like that word right there. Where is that grace? Where is that understanding? Of course, we're not going to talk like that anymore. But, they didn't know that was a thing for many years. How much grace can we afford them, or do they have to change everything right at this moment right here? But,
Well, I just think in part the message here is that no one is above the standard. No one is above, no matter where you came from. We all have a pattern to follow. God has laid that pattern down. And we're all expected to follow that pattern. And nobody's above that. Where you're, no matter what your last name is, or what part of the earth you come from, how much money you have in the bank, or your social status. Any of that matters. None of that matters.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that's part of the message. We got to be aware we're all held to the same standard.
right, absolutely. And the Jews wanted the Greeks brought up to this standard, but you'll read some of what Paul says here about, let's see, let's look at verse 17. Indeed, you are called a Jew and rest on the law and make your boast in God and know his will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. Paul acknowledges, you guys came up with God. You've been hearing his teachings your whole life. You've been going to Passover. You've been participating in synagogues. You've been taught. You can show, hey, these are the things that God is interested in. This is why we do this, because God loves this aspect of it. But then verse 21, you therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. Here's the Jews saying, hey, you got to be circumcised. We were circumcised. You got to contribute 10% because we had to do 10%. He's saying all these things from the old law, which weren't wrong under the old law. But Paul says, but are you guys actually doing that? Oh, you guys, you can't do that stuff anymore. I mean, we can still not obey the law. That's why they lost their kingdom. That's why God rejected them, because they were not keeping the law. And here they are saying, yeah, we're better because we did this one thing. So now you guys have to do it. But there's that not holding, they're holding them to a standard that was higher than even the Jews themselves were following. And Paul says, Jesus has done away with that. Here's the standard everybody is to follow.
He kind of summarized chapter 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
The Gentiles were sinful, and they had gotten so sinful that they're just hopelessly sinful. But the Jews were hypocritical.
Yes.
They had, chapter 3 says, what advantage do they have? They had the advantage of having the law, the prophets, and all that. But it's like having resources but ignoring them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they did. And it seems when you read 17 through 21, 22 or so that you just read,
Mm-hmm.
Paul's kind of throwing, it's kind of like an irony sort of deal. You make this boast and you claim that you have this, that, and the other, but you're not doing it. Not really. You're very hypocritical about it. And that seems to be the problem that the Jews had with it. They had the name of being the people of God.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the reputation of being the people of God. So they decided, since we're the people of God, that we can do anything we want to and not worry about it. God will always take care of it. That's the problem they had in AD 70 when the Romans attacked. You had a contingent of them who believed that if they got in the temple, they just held on long enough that God would come and save them.
Right.
They didn't realize that God was bringing the destruction on them because of the way they acted,
Mhm.
the attitude that they had. And so you can have the same thing, an individual who believes that because my name is on the roll somewhere of the Church of Christ, that I'm going to be saved no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Or if the Church of Christ teaches this, then it's right no matter what, because we're always right and everybody else is always wrong. You can make a distinction sometimes between Christians and the Church of Christers,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to be Christians.
Absolutely. 2,000 years later, it's easy to picture somebody saying, listen, I've been here the whole time, okay? And before that, my daddy was at this, famous Church of Christ over here, and his daddy would, helped establish the famous Church of Christ over there. So I'm telling you how it is. Well, I'm still just a man. And maybe what other people taught is not what I'm teaching. And maybe what I'm telling you to do is not what I'm doing. And we have to constantly have that examination. Now, does that mean the people, the first generation Christians, those Gentiles there, they could kind of get off, pretty easy? Like they didn't really have to try that hard? No, Butch said the same standard for everybody. They still had things to live up to. They were still in sin, but where's that grace in dealing with those sinful brethren?
Hey, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
There's something interesting about the way you said that just now, because that reminded me that there were times that God reminded the people of Israel in the Old Testament that there should be one law for you and for the stranger among you.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't a new thing that we have to have the same standard for same people.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reassertion of what should have been true from the beginning for God's people.
One of the problems that the Jews face in the New Testament is that when God said, I'm going to separate you to be a special people, that got twisted by man to the point where you're better than everybody else. You good, them bad. And that's not the message of the Old Testament. The message of the Old Testament was don't intermarry with them because they may, turn you away from the God that you love. But the point was not to hate everybody else. But by the time you get to Jesus' day, that's the state. We hate them. They hate us. We can almost get into that trap a little bit. Where we say, well, we're here in the Church of Christ, so we're good. And everybody else out there is bad. That's not how we're supposed to view everybody else out there. How are we supposed to view them?
people would want to be one of us.
Does Jesus love those people?
Absolutely.
Does God want salvation for everybody that's outside of a Church of Christ building right now? Absolutely. And that's what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to take their ways, but we're supposed to be teaching. We're supposed to be serving as an example. We're supposed to be lights. And the Hebrews, by the end of the Old Testament, are kind of like, let's just keep our light over here and hate on everybody else. And I don't believe that was ever God's intention. All right, let's skip later to near the end of the book. We'll look at one more section there in Romans chapter 12 and 13. As you skim through, as you look at the topics of the headlines there, Romans 12 and 13, what issues troubled the brethren in Rome, and how might that have affected their relationships with one another? So think back to what you know about the Roman Empire. Think back to what you know about maybe the gods they worshipped versus the God of the Bible. You have this group of people that are navigating their way through after the death of Jesus and are forming this church and working together. What are some of the things that they might have been going up against? I'll go with one big one. Why does Paul have to write to the Romans at the beginning of chapter 13? Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. You see any, not irony, but do you see some...
Persecution from the government.
What do we know was the relationship between the Roman government and the Christians?
At the beginning, the Roman government protected the Christians against the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
The Jews were the main ones who persecuted them. You see a number of times that Paul, he was in Rome because the Roman government in Jerusalem had saved him from the Jews killing him.
Mm-hmm.
And he had appealed to Caesar. He used his Roman citizenship. At the beginning point, they saw Christianity as a branch of Judaism like Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes,
Mm-hmm.
and so they were legitimate and they were protected. But then, after this time, they began to persecute them. So this is kind of, in anticipation of it, that God has established government to order society, and that we're to be subject to that as much as we possibly can. So that he's telling them that Paul's a prisoner of Rome, but he's a prisoner under protection really, of Rome.
The Romans don't step in under this skirmish of the Jews until Paul says, hey, wait a minute. If Paul doesn't say, hey, wait a minute, I'm Roman, Paul probably doesn't see the end of that day. It's his Roman citizenship that protects him, but the Romans are like, we don't really care what's going on with the Jews. There's just one more group with one more religion and one more land that they've conquered. Do you know anything about Roman emperors in general? Nero's not the emperor yet. Probably when Paul's writing this, it's probably still Claudius, but Nero is his son and will be the next emperor. Do you think highly of Roman emperors as loving human beings, kind rulers?
There were some that were good, but there weren't a whole lot. There were some that started good and turned bad. And, there was a whole range of things. There was one that started out as a slave,
Mm-hmm.
and he was adopted by one of the other Roman emperors, and he wound up being emperor. So, that's good, bad, and ugly.
You think our politics is crazy now. I mean, read the history of the Roman emperors. I mean, you ruled and you enjoyed, your big cup of wine and watching the people getting slaughtered, but you always were kind of looking behind you. I mean, people murdered their mothers, their children, their uncles. This was a savage time. And the grounds that they had made in democracy, they still were just men corrupted by power. And yet Paul is saying, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. Now, we don't have police barring us from in here, but if we had to meet in secret, or we knew that the government really didn't want us meeting and doing being here together, would that cause any kind of tensions among us? I mean, we have some tensions among us based on our politics now. Can you imagine what it was like 2,000 years ago? So again, kind of problems that they might have had, and so kinds of things that Paul is addressing. I'm running out of time, so we will stop here. Again, we're just trying to look at the churches of the New Testament and kind of making connections between what they might have been going through and problems and strengths we might have today. I appreciate your time. We'll pause for a break before our worship.